This is a made-up story that was written to entertain. Please tell us where you are watching from in the comments before we start. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. In the oppressive summer heat of 1954, when the Cold War had turned the American landscape into a chessboard of secrets, and the federal government ran huge networks of secret programs that regular people had no idea were going on, the Ozark National Forest Service got what seemed to. It was just a normal missing persons report that would eventually reveal one of the most carefully hidden and brutally suppressed operations in the history of American intelligence activities. 3 very experienced adult hikers had completely disappeared from the Black Fork Wilderness area in Arkansas, which is hard to get to and dangerous. A part of the ancient Boston Mountains that had never been explored and where modern communication technology had never reached, where the thick canopy of tall trees blocked all radio signals. These trees had been silent guardians of dark government secrets for decades. Through careful investigation, it was discovered that the missing people were Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, a highly respected geology professor at the University of Arkansas, who had more than 15 years of field research experience. His devoted research assistant, Isidore Vance, is a 26-year-old graduate student who is known for his methodical approach to scientific work. Detail and their experienced local wilderness guide, Thaddeus Merrick, a weathered 51-year-old outdoorsman who was known throughout Newton County for his encyclopedic knowledge of the most isolated trails and hidden hollows that crisscross the remote wilderness areas like an invisible network of pathways known only to those who had dedicated their lives to learning the subtle signs of this ancient landscape. The strange disappearance happened during what should have been a carefully planned geological research trip. Journey. The last fieldwork for Professor Ashworth's 10-year-long in-depth study of the complicated mineral formations that made up the Arkansas Ozarks' one-of-a-kind geological structure. Dust. For almost 10 years, Ashworth had been carefully studying the unique geological features of this ancient mountain range. He had built up an impressive academic reputation as one of the world's leading experts on the incredibly complicated geological processes that had shaped this prehistoric mountain range through millions of years of gradual erosion and mineral formation, over millions of years of slow erosion and mineral formation. His groundbreaking scientific work had drawn a lot of attention from not only prestigious academic institutions and professional geological societies, but also from mining companies and, more worryingly, from several federal government agencies that were very interested in finding out the strategic mineral potential of remote wilderness areas in the southern United States at the height of the Cold War, when rare minerals found in the United States became very important for national security. The trip that ended with their complete disappearance was supposed to be the final research project for Dr. Ashworth's upcoming full-length academic book on Arkansas mineral formations. A big academic project that was supposed to make him the permanent scientific authority on Ozark geology. The university had officially asked for the book to be written. Of Arkansas Press and geological societies all over the area were looking forward to it. Dr. Ashworth had spent months planning this trip, carefully going over detailed topographical maps and putting together all the specialized equipment needed to do thorough mineral sampling in remote wilderness areas. Isidore Vance, a very smart 26-year-old research assistant who worked with Professor Ashworth, had been. For 3 years, he worked closely with a well-known professor as his main research assistant, always showing that he was very skilled and dependable in all areas of complicated geological fieldwork. Vance was well known in the academic world for his incredible attention to scientific detail and his exceptional technical skills with the advanced photographic equipment that was absolutely necessary for accurately recording geological findings for strict academic purposes. Publication. His family in Little Rock, who knew him well and understood his naturally cautious personality, later told the police that he was a very responsible and safety-conscious person who would never take unnecessary risks or go into unknown territory without being properly prepared and having a full set of emergency procedures. Vance and Vance worked together professionally for 3 years, accompanied Dr. Ashworth on literally dozens of similar geological research expeditions throughout Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and several other challenging wilderness regions, never encountering any significant difficulties or emergency situations that could not be resolved through proper planning. Thaddeus Merrick, the experienced local wilderness guide hired to lead the expedition through the dangerous Black Fork Wilderness, was probably the best woodsman in the whole Arkansas Ozarks area. At 51, Merrick, who was 51 years old, had spent almost his whole adult life systematically exploring and mapping the remote parts of the Arkansas mountains. Over time, he gained an incredible amount of knowledge about the area's geography that went far beyond what could be learned from any official government maps or geological surveys. Merrick knew everything there was to know about every major trail, every important landmark, every reliable water source, and most importantly, how to stay alive in this tough environment. He was aware. The locations of most of the hidden and unmarked paths that connected the isolated hollows and ridges of the Boston Mountains in a complex network of secret routes that were largely invisible to outsiders and completely unknown to government mapmakers who had never invested the time necessary to develop true understanding of this ancient landscape's hidden secrets. Merrick was thought to be almost perfect by local hunters, experienced fishing guides, and seasoned outdoorsmen all over the area. Came to wilderness navigation and survival skills, even in the most difficult terrain that the Arkansas mountains could throw at travelers. His deep knowledge of the wilderness went far beyond just knowing how to get around. He had an almost supernatural ability to understand how animals behave in different seasons, where to find reliable water sources at different times of the year, and the safest ways to get through dangerous terrain, which was most important for the safety of the expedition. He had gotten to the point where he could almost see the future, the ability to predict changes in the weather that could make expeditions into remote wilderness areas where rescue would be impossible very dangerous. Merrick had been successfully leading hunting parties, fishing trips, geological research groups, and government survey teams through the most difficult parts of the Ozarks for more than 20 years. He had never lost a single person or had a serious accident due to bad planning or bad choices. Everyone who had ever worked with him, including Forest Service staff who had worked with him on many complicated search and rescue operations, respected and trusted him completely because he always planned his routes carefully and insisted on being well prepared before going into remote areas. Forest Service headquarters personally gave Rangers Barnabas the job of leading the first search and rescue mission. Kane and Ezekiel Cross were both very experienced woodsmen who had spent the better part of a decade patrolling the vast wilderness areas of Newton and Pope counties. Superintendent Josiah Bramwell, a career Forest Service administrator, personally chose these two rangers for the job because he thought they were the best people for the tough search and rescue missions in the Black Fork Wilderness area, which is known for its rough terrain. Superintendent Bramwell had worked with both men many times before on complicated wilderness emergencies, and he trusted their professional judgment, technical skills, and personal commitment to wilderness emergencies and complicated search operations that needed extraordinary skills and unyielding determination. He chose Kane and Cross for this case because they had a history of successful rescues and showed that they could work well together as a team even when things were very stressful. At the time of these events, Barnabas Kane was 34 years old. He was a decorated World War II combat veteran who had served with great distinction in some of the most dangerous operations in the Pacific Theater. He returned to his home state of Arkansas in 1946 to begin what he hoped would be a peaceful career with the Forest Service. He had been given a very specific job in the military to do highly specialized reconnaissance units that worked alone behind enemy lines in jungle terrain that was very similar to the thick forests and difficult terrain of the Arkansas Ozarks. His long time in the military had taught him how to read landscape features with great accuracy and spot small signs of human activity that other people might not notice. This very specific training had been extremely useful throughout his career with the Forest Service, where his exceptional ability to track down missing people and read subtle signs in the environment made him one of the best search and rescue specialists in the whole region. His co-workers in the Arkansas National Forest System recognized him for this. Kahn joined the Forest Service in 1948 because he wanted to work in wild places that he had loved since he was a child in rural Arkansas. His time in the military had taught him a lot about discipline, better organizational skills, and the ability to stay calm under a lot of stress. All of these are very important for doing search and rescue work in the wilderness, where making the right choice in a split second could mean the difference between life and death for people who are lost, hurt, or stuck in dangerous situations. During his 6 years of dedicated service with the Forest Service, he took part in many successful search operations and became an expert in the field. Reputation for being persistent, thorough, and having the amazing ability to find people when other experienced searchers had given up and told them to stop looking. His co-workers trusted his judgment and often turned to him for help when they were dealing with search situations that were especially hard or dangerous. Ezekiel Cross, who was 42 years old and had been working for the Forest Service since 1938, was well known in the Arkansas area as one of the best. Skilled trackers who work in search and rescue operations in the wild. He had gained his incredible knowledge through 16 years of hands-on work with hunting parties, lost hikers, missing persons cases, and even some criminal investigations that required tracking suspects through the toughest terrain that the Arkansas wilderness system could throw at him. Many of Cross's co-workers said he had an almost supernatural ability to read subtle signs that other experienced trackers might miss entirely. Trackers might not even notice. A broken twig that is hard to see shows that someone has recently walked through. Soil changes that are almost impossible to see show the direction of travel, or small changes in plants that suggest human activity where it shouldn't have happened. Other Forest Service rangers in the Arkansas area often asked Cross for help when they were having trouble tracking something that was too hard for them to figure out on their own. He had a great reputation for solving cases that seemed impossible. A bit of a legend in the group, he had an instinctive sense of how people moved through difficult wilderness areas, how environmental factors changed their decision-making processes in emergencies, and where they were most likely to look for shelter when they were in serious trouble that threatened their survival. Cross was very good at tracking people because he had both very advanced technical skills and a deep understanding of how people act. Effective at finding people who are missing, even when the chances of success seemed very low. People in the Forest Service knew that both Kane and Cross were very organized when it came to search and rescue operations, and that they could read signs that other people might miss. They had worked together as a team many times before, and had built a strong partnership that made the most of each person's strengths while making up for any weaknesses. Flaws. Kane's extensive military training and reconnaissance operations perfectly complemented Cross's civilian tracking skills and natural ability to understand how animals behave in the wild. This made for a search team that could work well in even the toughest terrain that the Arkansas wilderness system could throw at them. Over millions of years, the ancient limestone bedrock in the Black Fork Wilderness area has slowly eroded, creating a landscape of. There were big differences and very difficult terrain that made the area both scientifically interesting and very dangerous for people who weren't used to traveling there. Steep ridges that rose 300 feet or more above the valley floors separated narrow valleys carved by ancient streams. This made a complicated maze of isolated hollows and hidden passages that could easily confuse even experienced hikers who were not familiar with the geography of this area. The area's geology is mostly made up of limestone formations. We're full of solution caves, underground passages, and huge cavern systems that formed over millions of years as water eroded soluble limestone bedrock. Some caves were huge rooms that could hold whole buildings, while others were narrow, winding passages that could easily trap explorers who weren't careful and didn't have the right gear or a lot of experience navigating underground. The water moved through this complicated underground network in ways that often went against what seemed to be common sense on the surface. They would mysteriously come from springs with no clear source and disappear into sinkholes that seemed to swallow whole streams without any visible outlet or overflow mechanism. The Black Fork area was mostly covered by mature hardwood forests that had never been logged on a large scale because they were too far away and too hard to get to. There were a lot of ancient oak trees with trunks that were 4 feet or more in diameter. It was so thick that it was hard to see the ground even in the brightest daylight hours. The forest floor was always in twilight, which could be mentally confusing for people who weren't used to being in such places. Under this thick canopy of old trees, a thick understory of dogwood, red bud, wild elea, and many other native shrub species made it very hard to get around, except on the few established trails that had been cut through the forest over the years, for use by hunters, trappers, and people who work for the Forest Service. The forest floor in the area was covered with thick layers of rotting leaves, fallen branches, and other organic matter. These not only muffled sound, but they also hid dangerous changes in elevation. There are hidden dangers like fallen logs and exposed roots, as well as possible dangers like hidden holes that could seriously hurt hikers who weren't careful or didn't pay attention to where they were stepping while walking through the dangerous terrain. There were dangerous animals in the Black Fork area, like black bears that could be aggressive if they were surprised. Wild boars are the descendants of domestic pigs that escaped from early settlements and went back to living in the wild. They are sometimes hunted by mountain lions. Animals naturally try to avoid contact with people whenever they can, so encounters between people and big predators were not very common. A lot of poisonous snakes were also a problem for hikers. Timber rattlesnakes, copperheads, and coral snakes are all common in the area. All of them can bite someone who surprises them or threatens them by accident, and those bites could be deadly. The area also had large, aggressive groups of feral hogs. These are dangerous descendants of domestic pigs that escaped from farms in the 1800s and became completely wild over the course of several generations. These animals had grown into scary creatures that could be very aggressive when they were cornered or when they were protecting their young. Adult wild hogs could weigh several hundred pounds and had sharp tusks and strong jaws that could seriously hurt people who came across them in bad situations or who made bad choices when they were outside with these dangerous animals. The Black Fork Wilderness area had built up a bad reputation among the people who lived nearby over the years. Place where people sometimes went missing for no reason. Authorities usually blamed these scary events on dangerous terrain, but it was easy for someone to get lost in the confusing maze of similar-looking ridges and hollows and the many natural hazards that made rescue operations very hard, even when things were going well. Local folklore included many scary stories about experienced hunters who had gone off the beaten path and never come back to their families. Trails and never came back to their families. People generally think that their final fate will involve tragic accidents, like falling to their deaths from steep cliffs, running into dangerous animals, or just getting lost in an area where it was unlikely that anyone would be able to help them, and where it would be very hard for anyone without basic wilderness survival skills to survive. The detailed initial report sent to Forest Service headquarters says that Professor Ashworth and his research team was doing a thorough geological survey to get important scientific information for his next academic book on Arkansas mineral formations. The trip had been carefully planned for months, and both the university administration and the Forest Service had copies of the detailed itineraries. By the evening of August 14, 1954, the research group was supposed to have returned to their car, which was parked at the designated Mulberry Creek trailhead. This would have finished what should have been a normal 3-day research trip. Professor Ashworth's wife wasn't worried right away when the research team didn't show up at the meeting place on time. She was used to her husband's research trips taking longer than planned because of unexpected discoveries or delays caused by bad weather, which are common in wilderness research. But when the group didn't show up by noon on August 15th and didn't try to get in touch with the outside world, she was so worried about their safety that she called the Forest Service and asked them to start a search and rescue operation right away. Mrs. Ashworth told the Forest Service workers who took her first report that her husband was a very experienced and safety-conscious outdoorsman, even though he had a degree. For more than 15 years, Professor Ashworth had been doing field research in difficult wilderness areas in the southeastern United States, and was known among his co-workers for being very careful when exploring the wilderness. Before he left, he always filed detailed itineraries, brought enough emergency supplies for several extra days, and followed strict rules for staying in touch. The search started at dawn on August 16th, about 36 hours after the research team was officially reported missing. Rangers Kane and Cross followed the well-known trail system from the Mulberry Creek trailhead. They carefully examined every part of the terrain and looked for any signs of where the missing group might have gone off course or run into problems that could explain their strange disappearance. The weather had been clear and dry for the past week, and the trails were in perfect condition for tracking activities. This made it very unlikely that the experienced research team had to change their plans because of things like bad weather, flooding, or severe storms that could have made established trails impassable or caused emergencies that required immediate evacuation. The Rangers had a lot of search and rescue gear that was specifically chosen for long-term use in remote wilderness areas. This included a lot of first aid supplies, emergency food and water for several days, special rope and climbing gear for cliff rescues, and signal flares that could be used to talk to planes if aerial search became necessary. They also had powerful radios that, in theory, would let them stay in touch with Forest Service headquarters. However, radio communication in the Black Fork Wilderness was very limited because of the mountains and thick vegetation. By noon, on their first day of systematic searching, the Rangers had gotten to the general area where Professor Ashworth's detailed research notes, which were found in his hotel room in nearby Russellville, said the geological expedition was going to start their work on collecting and documenting minerals. This place was about 6 miles from the Mulberry Creek trailhead. You could get there by following a well-maintained Forest Service trail that went along the ridgeline above Black Fork Creek and led to several places known for their exposed limestone formations. The designated research area covered a few square miles of rough land around the planned geological sampling site. Kane and Cross carefully looked at everything: established trails and probable camping locations, meticulously searching for signs that the missing research group had arrived at their desired location or had commenced base camp activities. They looked for signs of recent camping, geological sampling or excavation work, and any signs of the special tools that Professor Ashworth would usually use in his research. Even though they looked very hard, they didn't find any signs that anyone had camped in the way. There was no disturbed vegetation in the area recently that could have been a sign of geological sampling activities, and there was no sign of the advanced research tools, sample containers, and paperwork that should have been there if the geological team had gotten to their research site and started their planned scientific work. What Rangers Kane and Cross found at that spot would eventually lead to one of the most hidden events in the history of the United States Forest Service. About 2 miles from the nearest established trail, in a deep, narrow hollow that wasn't shown on any topographical maps that Forest Service employees had access to, the two experienced rangers found clear signs of recent large-scale excavation work that was much bigger and more complex than anything that could be explained by normal geological research or legitimate scientific sampling. Steps. There were 3 huge holes at the excavation site, each of which. There are about 50 feet between each excavation, which is about 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The excavations are arranged in a precise triangular pattern. The holes were dug with great care, accuracy, and obvious professional skill. The sides were straight and vertical, and the bottoms were perfectly flat, which showed that professional excavation equipment and surveying tools were used instead of simple hand tools that amateur treasure hunters or casual archaeology fans might use. The triangular arrangement was so geometrically precise that it couldn't have been an accident or coincidence. This strongly suggested that the excavations were planned and carried out by skilled workers using the right surveying tools and following carefully crafted plans made by people who knew a lot about excavation methods and site preparation. The dug-up dirt had been carefully taken away and stacked in neat piles that were then carefully covered with freshly cut. Branches and forest debris that were clearly put there on purpose to hide something, which would have been almost impossible for casual hikers to see. The camouflage work was well done and showed that the person knew a lot about military-style hiding techniques. But the trained eyes of experienced Forest Service rangers who knew how to read subtle signs of recent human activity in wilderness areas could tell right away that the excavation work was new. More. The personal items and tools that had been left lying around the dig sites were even more disturbing than the digs themselves. It was easy to tell that these things belonged to the missing hikers. They were spread out in a way that looked like they had been placed there on purpose, not just dropped or scattered by people running away from a threat. According to his wife, Professor Ashworth always carried his unique leather satchel, was found lying next to the largest of the 3 excavations. It was on all geological research expeditions and had his most important field equipment. The satchel looked like it was in perfect condition, and when the rangers looked at it, it still had all of Professor Ashworth's field notebooks, geological identification guides, mineral testing equipment, and sample collection materials in it. Nothing seemed to be missing from its normal contents. The state and location of The investigating rangers found the satchel especially strange because it had been placed in such a way that it would be easy for anyone coming to the excavation site to see it. This made it seem like it had been put there on purpose to be found by search teams, which made it seem like it was meant to be a message rather than just abandoned equipment. Isidore Vance's high-end and costly camera gear was necessary for the research team's documentation processes and was a sign of. A large amount of money was spent on it, and it was found in several pieces near the second excavation site. But the camera and other photographic gear had not just been dropped by accident. It looked like someone had purposefully and systematically destroyed it to stop any photographic evidence of what the research team had seen at this site. The main camera body had been opened, and the lens had been cracked on purpose so that it couldn't be used at all. The film compartment had been forced open and exposed to bright light, which would have completely destroyed and made any pictures that might have been taken. The rangers found scattered photographic supplies, opened film canisters, and sample collection tools that Vance usually carried to help Professor Ashworth with his geological research work. These were all near the broken camera. Thaddeus Merrick's important safety and navigation gear, like his unique compass and A detailed map case that he was never seen without was found near the third excavation hole. Along with his usual hunting knife and the full first aid kit he always carried when taking groups into remote wilderness areas where medical help would not be available. The compass had been taken out of its protective case, and it looked like it had been purposely broken, with the face cracked and the magnetic needle moved around inside the housing, making the tool completely useless for navigation. The topographical maps in Merrick's map case were still there, but they looked like they had been handled quickly because some pages were torn and there was water damage that made it look like they had been dropped in a stream or left out in the rain. Cross made sure to note in his detailed first field report that the way these personal items were arranged and their condition seemed planned and intentional. Not like they were just left there by accident, an animal attack, or an emergency evacuation. The things had been put in place and spread out in a way that strongly suggested that they had been carefully placed instead of dropped, scattered, or left behind by people who were running away from danger or responding to an emergency. This planned setup suggested that whoever was behind the disappearance had spent a lot of time making a certain scene, maybe to send a message or make a certain impression on anyone who might eventually find the place. The planned destruction of cameras and navigation systems. Instruments showed that the criminals knew what kinds of evidence could help investigators and had taken steps to get rid of possible sources of information about what they were doing. The most upsetting thing Ranger Kane found was when he carefully climbed down into the biggest of the 3 holes using special climbing gear and rope from their search and rescue pack. At the bottom of the deep hole, there was some loose soil and forest debris that had fallen into it. He found what looked like pieces of wooden shipping crates with stenciled markings and identification numbers that he didn't recognize right away from his years of military service during World War II. The markings looked like military-style shipping labels and identification codes, but they were set up in a way that was different from the standard military logistics codes that Kane had become familiar with during his time in the military. Service in the Pacific Theater. A lot of the wooden pieces had dark, oily stains on them that had soaked deep into the wood grain and couldn't be removed by scraping or wiping. The material seemed to have strange physical properties that changed with the weather. It looked almost like gel at the bottom of the excavation, where it was cool and shady, but when it was in direct sunlight and warmer temperatures, it became more fluid and started to smell bad and different. Kane's detailed field notes said that the smell coming from the contaminated wood pieces was chemical and acrid, which is not something you would find in nature. The smell was complicated and seemed to have many different chemical parts. This made it seem like it wasn't just a simple petroleum product or a common industrial chemical, but rather a special compound made for certain uses. The smell stayed around, and it was hard to avoid being exposed to contaminated materials once you came into contact with them because they seemed to stick to clothes and equipment. While Kane carefully picked up some of the most intact wooden pieces for possible future analysis, Cross used his department-issued professional-grade camera to systematically document the whole scene. This camera was given to Forest Service employees to document evidence in cases that might need to go to court or detailed reports to federal agencies. Cross took many pictures from different angles to make a complete visual record of the excavation site, the way the personal items were arranged and their condition, and the physical features of the strange wooden pieces and contaminated materials found at the bottom of the holes. He also took pictures of the whole site, the hidden earth piles, and the land around it to give future researchers a better idea of what the site looks like. Police. The Rangers also found strong proof that the excavations weren't as new as the surface disturbance made them look, even though the holes had been carefully hidden with new plants and dirt that had just been moved. A closer look showed that the actual digging work had been done much earlier, maybe weeks or even months before the recent surface activity that had caught their attention. The walls of the excavations were clearly worn down by the weather and natural erosion that showed they had been in the environment for a long time before being disturbed recently. The ground at the bottom of each hole was packed down in a way that made it look like heavy things had been buried there for a long time before they were taken out in the operation that caused the surface disturbance. The Rangers' training told them to immediately try to radio their findings to the Forest Service headquarters in Little Rock to let them know what they had found and ask for clear directions on how to move forward with an investigation that was clearly more complicated than a typical search and rescue operation. Cross tried to get in touch with headquarters by radio, using the standard Forest Service communication equipment. But he quickly found out that their radio transmissions were being blocked by some kind of powerful electronic interference that was clearly man-made. They tried every frequency they could think of, but all they got was silence. A lot of static or a strange rhythmic beeping pattern that neither ranger had seen before in training or in the field. The beeping happened in a regular pattern that made it clear that it was coming from advanced electronic equipment, not natural radio interference or bad weather. The fact that the Rangers were using military-grade radio equipment that was made to work well even in tough situations made this intentional communication jamming even more scary. The state of the environment. The fact that their professional-grade communication equipment was being successfully jammed strongly suggested the use of highly advanced electronic jamming equipment by people with advanced technical skills and access to military or intelligence electronic warfare systems. Rangers Kane and their inability to talk to Forest Service headquarters and the clear need to tell higher-ups about what they found as soon as possible. Cross had to make the tough choice to leave the excavation site for a while and hike back to their car to use the more powerful mobile radio unit that was permanently installed in their Forest Service truck. They had to leave the site unguarded for a few hours, but they thought there was no other reasonable choice because their discovery was so unusual and they needed to tell their bosses about it right away. Before leaving, both rangers carefully marked the spot with standard trail markers, marking procedures and wrote down detailed notes so they could lead other people back to the exact spot if they needed to. It took them about 2 hours to get back to their parked car, which was a hard hike over rough ground that required careful navigation and a lot of physical effort. Both experienced rangers said they felt like they were being watched and followed the whole time they were in the thick forest, even though they didn't see any direct evidence of other people in the area and saw no clear signs of being watched or chased. These two experienced woodsmen, who were used to spending long periods of time alone in remote wilderness areas and had developed very good instincts for spotting possible threats or strange situations in forest environments, found this unsettling feeling to be especially troubling. Later, Cross said that the psychological feeling was like being in the crosshairs of a rifle scope, which made him feel uncomfortable because he was aware of hostile attention. Them to move through the woods as quickly as they could while always being on the lookout for possible dangers. Cross immediately tried to get in touch with headquarters using the much more powerful mobile radio unit that was permanently mounted in their truck when they finally got to the Mulberry Creek trailhead and their Forest Service vehicle. This mobile communication system had a much longer transmission range and more power than their portable handheld radios. It was made to keep them in touch with each other. Even from the most remote places in the Arkansas National Forest System, they could still get in touch with headquarters. The mobile radio successfully connected with Forest Service headquarters on the first try. This clearly showed that the communication jamming they had experienced at the excavation site was limited to the area around their discovery and not a problem that affected the whole region. This localized jamming pattern further confirmed that their communication. Someone had purposely made things hard for them so they couldn't report their discovery while they were still at the site. The next conversation with the Forest Service headquarters was short, formal, and according to Cross's detailed later testimony, immediately troubling in tone and content. When Cross gave a full account of their discovery of the excavation site, the hikers' scattered personal items, and the strange evidence they found had discovered at the bottom of the holes. There was a long and awkward pause before the radio dispatcher, who was officially known as Superintendent Josiah Bramwell, gave his answer and directions. Bramwell's response was very formal and sounded like it had been written down ahead of time. It was as if he had been told exactly how to handle this kind of report and had already made plans for how to do so. He told the Rangers to keep the area safe and wait for more orders without giving them any. More information about what kinds of extra people or resources would be sent to help with the investigation. The way he spoke and what he said made it clear that he wasn't surprised by their report and that there were already plans in place for how to deal with such discoveries. When Cross asked directly if they should keep looking for the missing men, and if more search and rescue workers would be sent to help find Professor Ashworth, Isidore Vance, and Thaddeus Merrick, Bramwell's answer was vague and unsatisfactory. He said that your top priority is to secure the excavation site. Other people and channels will take care of the other issue, and they will have the right authority and jurisdiction. This answer made it seem like the case of the missing person was less important than what had been found at the excavation site. This was a priority structure that made no sense to the experienced search and rescue professionals. Bramwell also told the Rangers very clearly to stay at the excavation site and not let anyone else in until a specialized team could get there to take charge of the investigation. He made it clear that no one else should be allowed to enter the site, no matter what authority or credentials they claimed to have. The Rangers were also told to keep their radios quiet, except for emergency communications. This order to keep radio silence was very strange and made people worry about who might be listening in on Forest Service communications. Silence was very strange and made people worry about who might be listening in on Forest Service communications. 3 hours after they called headquarters on the radio, a group of men came to the isolated excavation site in 2 black government vehicles. They didn't say they were Forest Service employees or show any official credentials that would explain why they had the right to take control of what should have been a normal Forest Service investigation of a search and rescue operation to save someone. The group of about 8 to 10 men was wearing unmarked green utility uniforms that looked like military clothes but didn't have any patches, insignia, rank indicators, or organizational markings that would normally show that someone was a military member or federal agent. The uniforms were clearly high quality and met military standards, but they were completely missing. The lack of identification was very strange and made it look like the people wearing them were trying to hide their identity and the organization they worked for. The vehicles that took this mysterious team to the remote site were specially modified for off-road use and had clearly been driven across the country through the woods on roads that regular civilian cars and standard government sedans couldn't use. The cars looked like they had been heavily modified with big tires and stronger suspension systems, and other tools that helped them get through the toughest parts of the Arkansas wilderness. This shows that the people who drove them knew the area well and had planned routes to get to hard-to-reach places. The leader of this secret group, a man in his 50s who was only known to his subordinates as Director Cavendish, walked up to Rangers Kane and Cross with the confidence and authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question or hesitation. As a career military officer, Cavendish spoke clearly and quickly, and he clearly knew a lot about operational security procedures and how to handle evidence. This made it clear that he had dealt with similar situations before. Director Cavendish told the Rangers right away that the excavation site was now under federal control and that they were no longer involved in the case. He didn't say what federal agency he worked for or what power he had. Gave him the power to lead a Forest Service investigation, or what legal grounds he had for doing so. His tone made it clear that he expected people to follow his orders right away, and that questions or complaints would not be tolerated. Cavendish was with about 8 men, who immediately began what looked like a well-planned and well-rehearsed cleanup operation that had clearly been planned and practiced ahead of time for this exact situation. The team members worked together and got things done very quickly. Everyone knew exactly what their job was and didn't need their boss to give them detailed instructions or watch over them. The specialized team had advanced tools, such as high-precision metal detectors, professional soil testing and analysis tools, and several large, heavy-duty containers that looked like they were made just for collecting and safely moving materials that could be dangerous. It was clear that the equipment was expensive, specialized, and not something that regular police departments or government operations would have. The Rangers saw that the team worked in a coordinated way that covered every square foot of the excavation area and went at least 100 yards into the forest in all directions. Team members used their advanced metal detectors to search systematically for. They dug up things that were buried, took soil samples from dozens of carefully marked spots, and carefully looked at every piece of debris or strange material they found during their thorough search. The thoroughness and orderliness of their search activities strongly suggested that they were looking for specific types of items or evidence, and that they knew a lot about what materials might be at the site and where they were most likely to be found. It looked like their search patterns were based on a lot of planning ahead of time and maybe some experience with similar sites and situations. Every piece of debris, every soil sample, every piece of wood, and any other item that might be of interest was carefully collected, labeled with detailed identification tags, and put in special containers that looked like they were made for handling dangerous or sensitive materials. It was easy to see that the containers had instructions for how to handle them and identification codes on them, and were handled with care that made it seem like what was inside was either dangerous to touch or very important to the investigation. Most importantly, Director Cavendish took the wooden pieces that Ranger Kane had found at the bottom of the excavation, and all of the photos that Cross had taken to document the scene and show what they had found. Before putting the wooden pieces in a special container, Cavendish looked at them very closely, and he looked at each of Cross's pictures one at a time before taking the film away. Cross's professional camera's exposed film was taken out on purpose and methodically destroyed in front of the watching Rangers. Cavendish made sure that every frame was completely exposed to bright light, making it completely unusable and unrecoverable. This destruction of photographic evidence was done slowly and on purpose, it seems, to make sure that the Rangers knew that no visual. There would be no record of the site or their discoveries that could be kept or shared with people who weren't supposed to see it. After all of the photographic evidence was destroyed, Cavendish typed up a statement that was clearly written in advance and gave it to the Rangers to sign. The document said that they had searched the Black Fork Wilderness area for the missing hikers in a thorough and organized way, but they had not found any signs of Professor Ashworth, Isidore Vance, or Thaddeus Merrick, and that their search did not work. The statement had clearly been written long before they found the site, which suggests that they knew they would find it and what was inside. It also suggests that they had already set up rules for how to handle such a find. The document was professionally formatted and typed to meet the standards for official government reports, including the right legal language and terms used in government. Ranger Kane asked if the statement was true, pointing out that they had clearly found a lot of evidence at the excavation site that was related to the missing hikers. It was clear and openly threatening that Cavendish responded. He said, "Your report will be exactly what this document says, in a way that made it clear that you couldn't disagree. Other agencies with the right authority will handle the case of the missing person. You have done your part in this matter, and it would be very unwise for you to talk about what you think you may have seen anymore, as it could put your job and personal safety at risk. 2 members of Candish's team then led the Rangers away from the area and told them not to come back under any circumstances. The escort was done in a way that seemed polite on the surface, but made it clear that you had to do what they said. The men who took them to their destination had weapons that were visible but not openly displayed. This made the situation feel like controlled intimidation, which made it clear how serious the consequences would be for not following the rules. In the days that followed, both men noticed that headquarters had changed their normal patrol routes so that they no longer went through the area where they had found the evidence. When Cross asked why these changes were made, Superintendent Bramwell said that the area had been temporarily closed because of worries about geological instability and that getting to it could put people in danger. This explanation didn't fit with what the Rangers knew about the area's geology and seemed like it was meant to stop more questions. The exclusion zone was much bigger than just the area around the excavation site. It included several square miles of forest that they used to patrol regularly. There were maps that clearly showed where the restricted area started and ended, and both Rangers were told exactly what to do, to stay out of this area for any reason. The event marked the start of a series of troubling changes in Barnabas Kane and Ezekiel Cross's professional and personal lives. These changes would eventually lead both men to quit their jobs with the federal government and move far away from Arkansas. The changes started almost right away and seemed to be meant to keep them away from their coworkers and limit their access to sensitive information that could be connected to their discovery. Both of them found out within a month of the discovery. Rangers got what looked like normal transfers to other parts of the Arkansas National Forest System. The transfers were sold as chances to move up in your career, and they came with pay raises and better benefits. But the fact that the assignments were moved at different times and to different places made it seem like they were being moved on purpose to stop working together. Kane was sent to the Ozark St. Francis National Forest headquarters in Russellville, which is about 150 miles away from his last job. His new job was mostly administrative, and it involved things like looking over permit applications, keeping track of equipment inventories, and working with local police on everyday matters. The assignment was a big change from the fieldwork he had been doing before. Cross was moved to the UA National Forest headquarters in Hot Springs, which is about 150 miles from where he had been working before, but in the opposite direction from where Ka was going to work. His duties included running the visitor center, coming up with educational programs, and doing public relations work that kept him in touch with civilians instead of other Forest Service employees. These transfers put more than 300 meters between the two men and made sure they would never have to work together again or keep in touch through official channels. The fact that they were in different places made it hard for them to talk about their experiences or compare what they knew about the excavation. Finding a site. Later, both Rangers said that their new jobs seemed to be meant to keep them away from their coworkers and limit their access to sensitive information. It looks like their bosses at both places got detailed briefings about their backgrounds, including information that wasn't in their regular personnel files. This made it seem like their new bosses had been given specific instructions on how to deal with these employees. The event started to have an effect on people's minds, and both men within weeks of their transfers. Kane had trouble sleeping all the time and told a Forest Service doctor that he had dreams about the excavation site that were so vivid and disturbing that he often woke up feeling like he had really gone back there. He said that in these dreams, he found more holes that were deeper than the ones they had already found. These holes held things he couldn't identify, but they filled him with fear. The dreams were different in some ways, but always included finding proof that the excavation site was part of a much bigger operation that stretched across the Arkansas wilderness. Cross started having panic attacks when he had to work in areas with a lot of trees, especially ones with limestone formations that were similar to the geology of the Black Fork wilderness. During these attacks, the heart raced, the person couldn't breathe, and they felt like they had to get away from the area as quickly as possible. The attacks were not caused not just by being in similar terrain, but also by looking at pictures or maps that showed those areas. The indirect threats that both men started getting at their new jobs were worse than the stress they were under at work. People who said they were doing routine security clearance updates for Forest Service workers came by to do these things. During these visits, which took place at the rangers' homes and were carried out by men who didn't show any ID other than saying they were from the federal government, both Kane and Cross were reminded that their jobs with the federal government required them to keep things private. The visitors stressed that talking about certain events with people who aren't allowed to could lead to losing their federal benefits and possibly being charged with a crime under national security laws. Even though no specific events were named, the timing and setting of these visits made it clear that they had something to do with what happened in the Black Fork wilderness. These visits to scare people happened about once every 3 months, and they always followed the same pattern. 2 men would come to the ranger's house in the evening when family members were there. They would say they were federal security officers doing routine interviews, but they would never show you any written proof of their authority or credentials. The visits usually lasted 30 to 45 minutes and included a lot of questions about the ranger's recent activities, friends, and conversations. The questions were meant to stress that the rangers were always being watched and that their compliance with confidentiality rules was being watched. Both rangers decided to quit their federal jobs by the winter of 1954 because they couldn't take the stress and threats that had become a part of their lives. It was hard to make the decision because both men had planned to work for the Forest Service for a long time and had put a lot of time and effort into it, knowledge and experience within the company. In December 1954, Kane quit the Forest Service. He had gotten a job with a private timber company in Oregon that paid and offered benefits similar to those he had as a federal employee. He said he needed to move closer to family for personal reasons. Cross quit in January 1955 and told his boss that he wanted to look for jobs in the private sector that would be better for his career in the long run. Not one of them publicly talked about the real reasons they left their jobs with the federal government, and their departures were treated like normal personnel changes that didn't get any attention from other employees or the media. Their bosses accepted their resignations without trying to talk them out of it, and the transition went very quickly and smoothly. If it weren't for Ambrose Caldwell, an investigative journalist with the Hoosier, Arkansas Democrat, who wrote about the first missing persons report in 1954. Caldwell had always been upset by the lack of information about the case and the fact that state officials didn't seem to be doing anything to find the missing person. Caldwell had spent most of his career covering local politics and business news, but he was known for doing thorough research and following up on stories that other reporters might give up on when they ran into trouble. Sources that are official. His investigation into the case of the missing hiker started out as part of a bigger series of articles about unsolved cases in Arkansas, but as he found proof of a cover-up, it became his main focus. Caldwell's first questions led him to find out that both Say and Cross had quit their jobs with the federal government soon after the incident and moved to states far away. He thought this pattern was strange because both men had been seen as great workers with good chances of getting ahead in the Forest Service. Moving up in the Forest Service. He called the Forest Service to ask about the case and was told that all records related to the search had been sent to other agencies and were no longer available. Caldwell was interested in this apparent bureaucratic stonewalling, so he started a more organized investigation by using the Freedom of Information Act to ask for documents about the incident. Caldwell was able to find Ezekiel Cross in 1963. He had moved to Medford, Oregon, where he worked as a consultant for private security. Cross didn't want to talk about what happened at first, but Caldwell's persistent and polite approach finally got the former ranger to share his story. Cross told Caldwell in great detail about the excavation site, the strange cleanup operation, and the pressure he had felt to keep quiet about what had happened. Most importantly, Cross said that he had broken the rules by keeping a small sample of the strange substance they had found at the site of the dig. He had hidden the sample in his own things, and even though his gear was taken, he was able to keep it. There were pieces of wood from one of the broken crates in the sample. They were still stained with the dark, oily substance that had caught their attention. Cross said he had kept this stuff for almost 10 years because he didn't know what to do with it, but he didn't want to throw away evidence that might be important later. He had put the sample in a sealed box in a safe place, and every now and then checking it to see if its traits changed over time. Caldwell set up for Dr. Matthias Brennan, a chemistry professor at the University of Arkansas who specialized in industrial compounds and had security clearance to work with potentially sensitive materials, to look at the sample. Dr. Brennan did the analysis in his own lab so that it wouldn't make an official record that might get the attention of federal agencies. Groups. The analysis showed that the substance had small amounts of several rare chemicals, some of which were not available for civilian use in the 1950s. Most importantly, the analysis found traces of substances that were linked to military experiments, such as early chemical defoliants like those used in Vietnam, industrial solvents used to make weapons, and stabilizing agents used to store and move explosive materials. Dr. Brennan's report also found tiny amounts of radioactive isotopes that were similar to those used in early nuclear weapons research. The amount of radioactive materials was not high enough to pose an immediate health risk, but their presence showed that the substance had been in contact with things related to the development of nuclear weapons. With this proof in hand, Caldwell stepped up his investigation and started looking into the history of military operations in Arkansas in the 1940s and the first few years of the 1950s. He found out that the Black Fork Wilderness area and other remote places in the Arkansas Ozarks were used during World War II to store military supplies that were too dangerous or sensitive to keep at regular bases. The War Department's documents, which were made public in the late 1950s, showed that a number of remote places in the Arkansas Ozarks had been chosen as special storage sites for experimental weapons, chemical agents, and other classified materials that could have put security or safety at risk and should not have been stored at regular military bases. In early 1964, Caldwell found Barnabas Kane in Salem, Oregon. He confirmed Cross's story about what happened and gave more information about the cleanup operation. Most importantly, Kane said that he had heard a conversation between Director Cavendish and one of his subordinates while they were being led away from the scene. In this, Cavendish had talked about Protocol 7 in the conversation and said that this was a planned response to finding secret burial sites. The subordinate had asked about getting rid of assets, and Cavendish had said that the Arkansas situation had been handled according to normal procedures. In the summer of 1964, Caldwell's investigation hit a major turning point when he got access to secret documents through Dr. Lander Crane, a source in the Department of Defense who was worried about the moral issues with the programs he had helped run. Dr. Crane was a retired Army colonel who worked on weapons development and logistics in the 1940s and 1950s. The papers that Dr. Crane gave us had a lot of information about Operation Deepwoods, a big program that used remote forest areas in the South to store and get rid of experimental military materials from 1943 to 1955. These secret papers say that Operation Deepwoods was set up to find a way to store things that were too dangerous or politically sensitive to keep at regular military bases. Operation Deepwoods kept a lot of different things, like prototypes of chemical weapons being made for possible use in the Pacific Theater during World War II, radioactive materials used in early nuclear research, and biological agents being made for possible military use. These materials were very dangerous to people's health and the environment, which made there. It is not a good idea to store things at regular military bases. The program used a network of burial sites in national forests in the South. These sites were chosen because they were remote, unlikely to be found, and under federal control, which made it easy to keep people out. These papers called the Black Fork Wilderness Area Site Arkansas 7, one of more than 30 similar places in the Arkansas Ozarks. The most shocking thing was that Operation Deepwoods included full plans for security measures to be put in place when civilians accidentally found sites, a secret manual called Security Protocols for Asset Protection spelled out these steps. It included everything from bribery and intimidation to, in the worst cases, permanent solutions to security breaches. The manual made it clear that the program didn't care at all about the safety of civilians, and that keeping things secret was more important than keeping people safe. Lives of individuals. The language in the document was clinical and bureaucratic. It called civilian witnesses security liabilities, and their removal asset protection measures. Caldwell's source also gave him a full list of all the people who had been reported missing near Operation Deepwood sites between 1943 and 1955. There were more than 40 names on this list of hunters, hikers, researchers, and local residents who had gone missing for no clear reason in areas that were later found to be places to store things. Some of the names on this list were Isidore Vance, Thaddeus Merrick, and Professor Ashworth. Arkansas 7154 documented their disappearance as a security incident, showing that their removal was seen as a necessary security measure under the rules set up for Operation Deepwoods. As Caldwell got ready to publish his findings, he started to feel the same kind of pressure that the former Rangers had felt. In August of 1964, two men who said they worked for a federal security agency came up to him. They told him that his investigation was getting in the way of national security operations that were already going on, and that publishing his findings would have serious legal consequences. When officials told Caldwell's editor at the Arkansas Democrat that publishing the story would break federal laws about making classified information public, the pressure grew, even though Caldwell made a case. The newspaper's legal counsel told him not to publish the documents he had gotten because they were already declassified, and there was a chance of being sued. Internal security investigations found Dr. Lysander Crane in September 1964 and arrested him on charges of leaking classified information without permission. The rest of the Operation Deepwoods documents were quickly reclassified at higher security levels, which meant that journalists and researchers could no longer get to them, faced with too much. Caldwell stopped looking into the case in October 1964 because he ran into problems. During a search of Caldwell's office in November 1964, the chemical sample that Cross had given was taken. By the end of 1964, everyone who was involved in the investigation had been effectively quieted. The last chapter in the cover-up happened in 1965, when the few declassified documents about the program were quietly reclassified and put in safe storage. This was done because of new federal rules that made things bigger. The government's ability to keep national security information safe. More than 70 years after Operation Deepwoods began, the full truth is still hidden in federal archives that are protected by security classifications that may never be lifted. The story of Rangers Kane and Cross is a sad reminder that citizens need to be able to see what their government is doing in their name in order for democracy to work. The landscape of the Arkansas Ozarks looks like this for people who go there today, clean and free of its dark past. But behind this calm front is a history that pushed the limits between real security concerns and the abuse of government power.